canceled because of the weather. They were out the roads were still icy, but so thanks for venturing out and listening to Mr. Schleper again. A couple forms. I think this is the kind of the agenda today, what you're going to hear from him. And the other sheet, David's been so kind to, basically we've scheduled out through December. So this sheet, you'll see that you can take this, keep this, but these are the dates and times that we have scheduled through December. But it'll also hopefully be in our Park and Rec brochure and in the bi-monthly newsletter. So again, if you don't get the senior, 55 plus senior adult bi-monthly newsletter, let me know and I can get you on my email list. So I'll go make some copies and put them on your table too while he's chatting. So other than that, I'm just going to go sit down, do my duty, and let David take it over. Thanks, David.
Okay. And those of you who are not 55 yet,
stand up.
Stand up.
I take you all.
I was
don't
not
care
one
how
myself.
old you are. If you want to have fun, come on.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to just talk about the industries that we're starting in Shakopee way back. And it's really based on KSMM radio. Do you guys remember the KSMM radio, those of you who were in here in Shakopee? And they used to have different things going on there. Well, okay. So anyway, on KSMM radio, they used to have every first Wednesday of every month, starting in 1976, they had what was called TT&O. And it's basically this, that, and the other. It took me a while to figure out what that was, first of all, but I finally did it. But actually, there are actually tapes of their conversation that happened back then. So there's like a lot of them. And at the Scott County Historical Society, they actually have the tapes. But it's in tapes, you know, the old tapes. It's kind of like the reel to reel. I mean, it's almost like that, because these are the ones that you just put in a little thing, but you got to have the thing. Nobody has those things anymore. But anyway, I found that, and I started going through some of them. And this one was specifically Julius Collar, who wrote the Shakopee story. And he was on there once a month, and he would have different topics. And this one specifically was talking about the industry in Shakopee. And so I just found it really interesting. So I listen to them every once in a while. It takes, it's about an hour, and it's interesting conversation. And this one, they specifically talked about the industry that was most prevalent in Shakopee. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about. And the first one that they bring up is lime kilns. And that started in about 1851 and continued to about 1900. But at various times, different people. Now, when we talk about limes, it's important. It's not the little thing the fruit, right? But it's basically, it's just the white powder that's derived from limestone. And they've had kilns for over 7,000 years. Clearly somebody knew what they were doing when they first moved here, because they knew where they were looking and what they were getting in order to find them. And it's interesting because then after I learned about this, I looked at Moses Starr Titus. And he is one of the few people who was actually here before Thomas Holmes came here. And he gave an address in 1878 where he basically talked about what happened at the beginning when Thomas Holmes got here. And he said specifically, he pitched his tent and with a few adventures set about building a home. But the weather was hot, mosquitoes terrible, and thirsting for his blood. Now, I believe that's really true. Because I just remember growing up and going to Riverside Park. Remember the mosquitoes there? Oh, that was the one thing I hated. All right, and of course then they spread DDT all over or whatever, so. But anyway, he said, at that time he said it was quite a respectable building to put up. it was away from other people, places, and things. Now, understand that's not really true because there were other people living here before Thomas Home was here. Remember, there were 600 Dakota Indians who were living here in Tītau, which was basically where Memorial Park area and further over that way. It actually started probably at Somerville Street and goes all the way to Shenandoah Drive and about 3 miles this way towards south. Okay. But this is what he says. And then he says, logs were hewed outright, and in plastering within and without was lime of their own burning. And he said the kiln that was there was the first one in Shakopee. And he said, really, if they should ask the lime builders now to examine the architecture of what he did, because he knew and he could make good lime. And so they built this house, the one on the left. If you look at the picture above, on the left side, that was his original house. It was right up onto the river. And then he built this home store on the right 2 years later. So there's no pictures of them, and obviously there's no evidence of this, but we do know this is what happened. And it's also interesting because we talked about in 1851, they said most of Shakopee was covered with a dense growth of hazelbrush from 4 to 6 feet high, through which paths have been broken at various directions, but nearly always centered near a home store. So that was the place that people went to find out what was going on, to gossip probably, to get the information, that kind of stuff, okay? So this tells you just about what is the kilns and what they were doing. And they're basically taking the limestone from the bluffs that were down in downtown Shakopee area and quarries, and they made that into mortar and plaster. And they did that by fire. They put it in there and they burnt it at about 2,000 degrees. It was really hot. And then the stuff down below would come out and it would be like almost white powder, okay, and that was a lime. Unfortunately, you didn't really make a lot of money doing this, and that's what they found out. But it's interesting just that it was happening and it was needed. And you can find an example of a lime kiln from the Schroeder lime on Market Street. If you go downtown Market Street, and you know there's a church that used to be a church, but now it's Atlas Staffing. Okay, if you just go down another 2 blocks to the end of towards the river, and you turn right there is the this kiln, and there's actually a sign and it actually explains a little bit about what happened there. But it's just interesting that it's still there. And they say, just leave it, you know, they tell people just leave it. So far, it's still there. But it's interesting, but it just shows what they look like. The one thing that I would say, in terms of when they looked at lime kiln, is that it was a very, almost an individual job, like one person would do it. It wasn't like a whole group of people doing it. It was probably one person or 2 people. And it was hot. And you pretty much had to work, 24 hours a day, to keep it going all the time. And here's the most popular one probably was the one by Conter, the lime kiln. And here's just a picture of it, but it gives you an idea of what it looks like. They basically, from the top, you see the person there, they're dropping it into that, and then down below is what will come out. And the temperature was, they had to keep changing the temperature. And again, they said it takes several hours to get it finished, okay? Sometimes from 1 to 4 weeks if it was a very small place. And you know, you heard the word limelight. That kind of came from that because it was so glowing, there was always the light there. Okay. But they had to be careful because people could fall into the kiln. Or they could be sophisticated. I can't even say that word anymore. But you know what I'm talking about, okay? By the deadly fumes. So that was the problem that you really had to watch. And basically the kilns were used probably until probably around World War I. And then at that time it became more of a commercial thing as opposed to individual things that happened. But it's interesting because, let's see. Oh. So here's a picture with the actual photography picture. It was started in 1863, Johann Conter lime kiln. It looked like this. I just want to know, so where is it exactly? See the tall thing up there? That was St. Mark's. Okay. But it's on the river. Exactly where? I'm not sure exactly. I believe, though, it's more west than east. I believe. Okay. But this actually is a photograph of it, so it's just interesting to see. This was before the bridge. Yes. And it's important that basically the lime was used mostly for the agriculture. They used it actually to mix it in with the soil, okay, to make it, I think, to be acidic, yeah, whole soil. In other words, they call it sweetening the grass for livestock, okay? But it also was used for a lot of things. The mortar in buildings, so when they were building houses, and they'll come up a little bit later about the building of the houses here. But when that happened, they used the mortar from the lime. They also painted the walls. They called it whitewashing. They said that was for waterproofing, I guess. I didn't know that was waterproof, but I guess that's what it did. And they also say it kind of brightens the area, because if you paint it, it's better, it's white as opposed to a little darker. And they also say that they also do it to stop foot rot in livestock, as a medicine, to remove the hair from the hides in leather making, in cesspools, and also slug and snail repellent. Now, I didn't know any of these things, but I think, so I'm guessing if you look now and you go to Home Depot or Lowe's or any store and you need something related to lime, they probably have something that ties in, that has some of the same ingredients probably into that. It also used to get rid of ants, and with frost protection for the potatoes, for disease on fruit trees, although there weren't a lot of fruit trees here in Shakopee early on. For the pigs, for cabbage plants, and for the chickens, so that their eggs will be a little thicker. And Jack Collier, in this interview, he says, it was a long, dirty, hot job. You had to burn for 48 hours, then you had to clean it out, start again, over and over. And basically how much, in 1868, there were 4 different lime kilns here in Shakopee. Conter was probably the one that actually made enough money to keep going with it, ongoing, okay? they had 16,000 barrels. There was Isaac Lincoln had 14,000 barrels. J.B. Noble, okay, had 5,000, and Bernhardt's had 4,000 barrels. And Collier says in his book, or both in his book and in his interview, that basically those who were 5,000, they were making some money, but nothing worth. You couldn't live on it, I guess is the thing to say. Okay. So here again is just where it looked like again. And it's also though that, like when you talk about Conter, how do you know that he did so well with it? Well, you probably can look at his house. All right. So he has a pretty nice house, so you figure right away that he's probably making some money in the process. Okay. So that was lime kilns, and that was probably the first business that they had in Shakopee, and the most important one probably because it was related to building houses. The second ones were breweries and distilleries. There were actually 2 breweries and 2 distilleries that were in Shakopee back then. And again, if you walk down to the river, like where we were before, where we had the kiln, if you follow that river, there's a path for about 1.5 miles that way, towards west, you'll eventually get to, between, here's Shakopee, right? And there's Chaska, and right about in the middle is where the brewery is, okay? And it's still there. It's not, it's falling apart, and you can't go there. You can't go in. It's somebody's property now, but you can still look and see it, and I'll show you some pictures of it. But basically, 3 people were involved with this. First of all, Herman or Harmon, depending how there are different ones they say, but it's basically Herman Strunk, starting in 1854 until about 1862. Then he sold it to Andrew Winker, who was from 1863 to 1888, and then Neeson, and they did it from 1889 to 1921. Same place, same brewery. This is the one that's most popular, probably, I think. So that's Herman Strunk. Now, if you think about Strunks, what do you think about Strunks in Shakopee?
Drugstore.
The drugstore, right. And in fact, remember, he was only, for a short time, he was on here working on the brewery, and then he moved into town and started the drugstore and went on from there with him. Okay? And that's their house, the Strunk Nissan house. Okay, was Strunk's and then became Nissan's. And that's right close to the thing. And Herman Strunk was born in 1818 in Germany and moved to the United States in 1835 and to Shakopee in 1854. And he built the brewery for about 9 years, then he sold it to Winker, and then Herman Neeson. It kind of stopped with when Prohibition came out. Obviously because you can't. Why are you making beer when you can't do it? All right. It's also interesting that Strunk, once he started doing that, when he quit that, he just got a distillery. Sorry, you know, with my stroke, sometimes the words aren't coming out exactly, but a distillery, okay. That was very close to where the brewery is. He sold it to Krantz in 1873, and that's when he moved to Shakopee and did the drugstore. Okay. So here in 1891, this is what, now it's the same brewery, but now it's under Neeson. And you look, you know, this is in 1891, it just gives you This is a drawing, obviously. But there's also, you look at some of the maps and they'll actually show, you know, exactly where everything was back then. This was in 1890. It's just interesting because you can find interesting things. But what you find out in there is that there were several things that were happening in that brewery. This was in 1890, okay? You have the kiln. Remember we talked about the kiln for the other thing? So they have kiln here for drying the barley. Okay? Then you have the ice house. Okay? Then you have the horsepower room. And they actually had 1 or 2 horses who were, they were like kind of like on a treadmill that just go over and over and over, and that's how they gave the electricity for it. Okay. I just find that very interesting. What a crap job for the horse. And then there's the malt cellar, okay, that's where the barley is germinated. And then there's the mash tub, and that's where they heat up and mix the malt and water together, and they call that mash. Okay. And then there's the beer kettle, and that's where they boil the mash and the hops into a liquid called wort. See, I'm learning all these new things I have no clue, and I'll probably forget it later. But it is just kind of interesting, as this is what they talk about. And then basically they had pigs. I had, well, that's kind of strange. What's the pigs for? Well, they say actually that's how they, you know, the stuff that's left over, what do they do with that stuff? They ate it. So it's basically garbage disposal. Exactly. Garbage disposal, exactly. And here's what it looks like now. Like, these are pictures, but if you're just looking at what it looks like now. So it's just kind of interesting to see what does it look like. Excuse me. And here I did some photos myself too, you know. And here up here is like the little bottle there that they had. I don't have that. I wish I did because it's probably worth something. But anyway. And so that's one brewery that was going on, and then a distillery that was close by. Then there was a second one called the Union Brewery, or the Shakopee Brewery, okay? And that really kind of started by a husband. And you know, when I'm saying the names, they probably could be wrong. That's just how I'm pronouncing it, just, you know, so I could be wrong, just interpret that. Okay, he was born in Germany in 1827, and he married Anna Hopster, okay? They moved to America, and in 1865, they started the Union Brewery. And then they enlarged it in 1868. And then he died in 1873. And so they've been doing it since 1865. 1873, he dies. So what do? Well, it's interesting because then his wife took over. But she did it under the supervision of his son. I just think that's kind of a funny way to say that, because I'm guessing she's in charge. I don't think his son was in charge. But I think that's just the way they say it. Okay. But we do know that in 1886, the brewery caught fire. And the brewery and the house were burned down. Okay? But it's interesting that they kept all the beer in caves. Okay? And so the beer was saved. And they also know, and this is what Collar says in that interview, he says he remembers that the firemen who went to help afterwards went to the caves and had a great old time drinking beer. I think there was one person who was a barber shop in town, who was one of the volunteer fire department person, and I think he got his part of his fingers wrecked. What do you call it? Burnt off, I suppose. But other than that, was okay, except for that. But here is a picture, again, of the brewery. This is 1907. And you see the Shakopee Brewery.
They rebuilt it, obviously.
Yes. And here's another picture.
Where was this one?
So this is, I believe it was more closer to downtown. Okay, at least the brewery part itself. I do know, though, that it's tied into the same area because those caves are all in west part of town for the most. There's some in the east too, but I believe it's over probably more west. The reason I know about this is because in the 1930s, I think I have it down here. Yeah, Mr. Mertz, okay, one of the Mertz brothers, he ended up that same cave. Remember the one that had the beer that people drank all of it? Okay. The fire people, and then they probably were drunk for a few days afterwards. Okay. About in 1930s, that same area he used for mushroom growing. And they said they were big mushrooms, it was like about this big, you know, big mushrooms, right? And it was really popular for several years. People would buy mushrooms. And Collier said that you could fry one in a frying pan with butter, and it was delicious. Now, I don't think it's there anymore. Okay. And then the third, so again, those are the two breweries, and then we have the first distillery. This is the second one. This was the Northwestern Distillery. It's really interesting because the person who started, they don't say his name on the interview, and I haven't found out yet, so I will eventually probably hopefully find out who that person was. But he moved to Shakopee, and he said he could make whiskey, 7-year whiskey, in 6 months. Okay, so people bought into this whole thing, right? And they had several hundred cases of whiskey that was ready after 6 months, right? And then people would taste it, and they said it was awful. Collier said too, I don't know if he tried it because he says it burned all the way down their throat. And of course, the person who was in charge left out of town in a hurry. So it's just kind of an interesting story. Okay, the next thing that we have, the next industry is the bottling pop factory. And this started in 1872, and it continued to 1975. So it was here for a long time, okay? And I'm just going to show this and pass this around so if you want to look at it. But here's a good example of one of their bottles. This is the one before they didn't have, there's no top on it. This is how it is, so it's just kind of interesting to look at. So you just do that and move around. Just don't drop it. And you know, you've seen like this kind of thing too, which is the rock spring. That's tied into this. I'll explain that in a minute, but I just want to pass that around so you can look at it. And this is just, because I usually do this with kids, they don't know what this is. All right. Jacob Reese, okay? He came to Shakopee. He was from Luxembourg. And he met E.A. O'Leary from Ireland. And the two together on the river, on Home Street, all the way down to the river, they had a bottling company. So it's north of Home Street and First Street in 1872. O'Leary sold out 1 year later. You should have stayed. Okay, so, but they stayed there, and then what happens at that, in 1880, they moved to 3rd Street, 3rd and Home Street. And you probably, if you've lived in Shakopee, you would probably remember that place. I clearly remember walking down and just watching the bottles go by all the time. And I loved their Great Pop. That was the one, you know, that everybody watched. But they moved in 1880 because they set forth to avoid the flood plan. And it became the Jacob Rise Bottling Works, and then Rock Spring. Okay. And here's a picture of them in the 1880s. And this was on 3rd Street and Home Street. That's the inside. It's kind of, you can't see too much on it, and then the outside of it. But you know, there's a lot of stuff out there about Rock Spring. It was really popular, and it was specifically popular not only here, but all over the nation. And so the trains would stop almost a couple times a day, and they would drop off and pick up their bottles and send them all over. It was out in California. It was, I mean, all these different places. So that just shows what it looks like, and there was several other buildings that they used there also. And here just a picture of people doing some work, 2 different pictures there. A few other. And what color was their theme? Green. Yeah, I wonder if it was green. Well, first of all, here's this one. It's just you've seen this picture, but it's just a good one to show because see with the Rock Spring on the top there. There was a parade actually going by, but that just gives you an idea of this is their main building that most people would remember. And here, of course, is the color of the cars there. And it was very popular. Like I said, they stopped 2 or 3 times a day for loading and unloading. And they were sold out to Pepsi in 1975. They said that why did they sell it out is because they wanted to change the what do you call it? Formula. Thank you. Thanks. The formulas, they wanted to change it, and they didn't want to. And so they went back and forth, and finally they ended up selling it to Pepsi. Okay. And then the building itself was torn down in 1977. Okay? So some of you, if you were alive then, it was very popular to get a little bottle of the container and stuff like that, of this pop stuff. It's very, very interesting. And you go online now, there's lots of things on sale related to this too. It's a very popular place. Okay? Everybody okay so far? All right, the next thing we have is the Wagon Factories. When I first looked at this, I found one thing, and then I found out that actually the first person who built a wagon in Shakopee is John Kampf. Kampf, I think is how you spell it. He learned how to make them in Germany. In 1853, he moved to a plain 6 miles south of Shakopee. Now it's probably part of Shakopee, but anyway, but for the, let me see, yeah, this way, okay. Okay. And they had best hard timber there, and he used that, he made the first wagon. And in fact, in the thing, Scott County history says that was the first manufactured wagon in Scott County. But if you really talk about the one that you think about, it's the Wampach Wagon Factory, okay? And they built this 2-story framed building on 2nd and Lewis Street. And it was for both a blacksmith shop and also a wagon factory. Eventually, that area, so if you look at 2nd and Lewis Street, that where it was built, the railroad wanted that for the railroad and the right-of-way there, okay? So they bought it out. And so then the wagon company moved to 1st and Fuller Street. And here, you know, this is funny, there's no picture except on this picture, which is of the, a wedding party that was going at the Introp Homes. But if you look to the left there, on that thing there, manufacturer thing that says on there, that's actually the manufacturer place. And there's lots, if you look into most papers of early Shakopee, they will have ads about the things that they're making at the factory. And this actually is a picture. I think the first person in the front is a Veerling, actually. I can't remember which Veerling. In fact, I think I have a list of who all three of those people is, but I can't remember it now. But this is actually there's what they're making, obviously. And it started in 1881 as their official agreement. So they've been doing it before, but now it's actually was called in 1881. And it continued until the 20th century. And obviously, at that point, cars took over. But it's also interesting that there are other wagon shops in Shakopee. There was the Star Wagon Company in 1879. It's interesting because that person, which is a Wagner, he actually worked at the first company for 11 years, and then he built his own. And also there was a wagon and carrier maker in 1856 also. Here's an ad for that one. So there were more other ones, but the one that we most remember is the Wampap. And why do we know Wampap?
The restaurant.
The restaurant. And it's the same family ongoing, so just so you know. Not the same, but you know, generations. Okay. All right, this fifth one that we have is the St. Paul and Sioux City Railroad. And we do know, for example, that the first time a railroad train came to town was November 11th, 1865. And then once they were there and they were coming through, they go just to here. They didn't go beyond that at that time. It was still built, then they continued on. But in 1867, they decided to have a railroad shop here in Shakopee. And they had a machine shop, blacksmith shop, in the main building. And it was running there with 5 locomotives. And there's one thing, when I was reading one thing, they were talking about how people remember this shrill whistle of the shop, I think, of the shop engine calls the workmen together at 7 o'clock every morning. That wouldn't be me, I wouldn't be up that early. But it was a popular thing, and there were a lot of trains in town. And so in November of 1867, 147 passenger tickets to the value of $178.20. So there was work related to this. And it's also interesting because the trains were here and there, they ended up shipping. In 1 week, they had 4,600 pounds of beer. Okay. Remember where we got the beer from? Okay. Okay. We also had lime. Remember we talked about that? So that's where it came from. We have hoop poles, and I'm not sure exactly what that even is. Anybody know?
Is that the wagon?
I think it might be the wagon. That's my guess, but I do need to find it. But anyway, and then merchandise. So there's a lot that was sent out. And also they brought in to Shakopee about 135,000 pounds of freight to Shakopee. And that's in 1 week. So it was the time, it was the time when it's going. So people really, liked that. And here's a picture of the train in downtown Shakopee. Let's see what the things in the background.
Is the railroad station that's here the same one?
No, there are 2. There's actually 2. The one that we have now, which is now the quilt shop, That was the second. There was two depots, okay? Because there were two different lines that were going at the same time.
The hoop poles are straight, slender lengths of sapling wood of hickory or white oak used for barrel loops.
Barrel loops, okay, thank you. Good job. I knew there's somebody who, you know, that's like my nieces and nephews, they already figured that out.
Google it.
I know. All right, so this was going good, and this was a big thing, and it was a job, about 40 people in Shakopee worked there, okay? And it went fine until 1872, and there was a fire. And it destroyed the whole place. It was saying it was a loss of about $100,000 back then. So it was not a good thing, right? So the city was worried because they said, oh, now they're going to leave. So they offered $10,000 free if you will rebuild it here and agree to continue to stay in Shakopee. And the railroad said, they ended up building it again, but they didn't get that $10,000 because they didn't want to be stuck here. And what ended up happening is a few years later, it moved. So just so you know, so here's the depot, okay? And there's the Shakopee, one of the trains. And the building was rebuilt, but in 1882, they moved to St. Paul and Hudson, Wisconsin. And so 40 people were out of a job. In fact, they have a thing that said the large force of men expected to be employed never materialized. And within a year, the railroad shops, the pride of the town, was finally and completely removed. On Saturday, April 14th, 1883, the 40 employees were paid off and discharged. The vacant building alone remained as a reminder of what the shops had once been. And so at this time in Shakopee, and for the next probably 10 years, it was a depression in some ways in town because so many people lost their jobs. And then some people would leave Shakopee because of that too. All right, now we'll move on to the next one, which is the soap factory. And this started in 1872. And it's interesting because there's not a lot of information about them. We don't even know where they were here in town, but we do know that it was here. There's several paper articles that talks, that there are ads about them. It was popular for a short time. And here's like in 1873, it says the Shakopee soap factory is coming out in style. A very elegant soap wagon now parades our streets with the best soap made. Okay, so the potential was there, but within a short time, not too long ago, it was gone. And I haven't found, so this is of course since I've been the last 2 weeks, but I haven't found exactly when they closed. But I know that it was closed before too long, okay? In the caller, the interview, he doesn't mention when it was done. All right, the next thing is the flouring mill. The Rice brothers, remember them again? Okay, they built a mill established in 1859. It was a 3-story stone mill, okay? And they were used for 3 years, and then they were just left. So then nothing was happening. So the city again says, uh-oh, we need to get some more, because this is where people need jobs. So they authorized $3,000 for anyone who would erect and operate a flouring mill. Okay. And eventually, Woodward purchased the old mill. They repaired it and operated it for a few months in 1875. And then he sold it to George Strait and Company. And it was called the Shakopee City Flouring Mill. And here's a picture. That's Strait there, picture. And that's the Shakopee Flour Mill. And I think I have well, here's a good example where you can see it. You've seen this picture a lot, right? But there's the bridge and there's the big thing that's sitting there. That's the flour mill. We do know that in 1877, there was a fire. There's a lot of fires that happened in Shakopee. This was all before they had a fire department also. Okay. Obviously, they started thinking and decided to do that. All right. And again, here's what it is. The new mill after they redone. And eventually, other companies took over. So this is the Christian and Brother Company's flour mill here in Shakopee. It's the same place, it's just they've gone from place to place. And so what they found is there was a strike in 1920. And so that didn't go well for a while, but eventually they must have increased the pay or something. In 1822, there was a lightning struck the elevator there, and they never rebuilt that. But it was basically, it was still there, and was different companies would buy it, then a new company, new company, new company, and then finally in 1972 it was torn down. And now, of course, it was part of, to get, go from, on the highway, the new bridge that is there. But anyway, it's just kind of interesting. Here's another really interesting one, the Russ Jones Desk Company. And this is a funny one because we do have a picture of what it looked like, but your caller says, I have no idea where it was. We know it was there because there's pictures, right? We know that that it was moved to Shakopee in 1891, and 16 people worked there, and they continued for about 15 years, and then they left. Okay? The only reason we even know any of this, then I started looking because I was like, I want more information, and I ended up finding that there's actually was a patent of the desks that they were building here in Shakopee. So I found that. So that's, you can actually go online and you can actually read the whole patent. But here's actually the pictures of it and stuff. So we know that it was there and it was popular. But I have never found anyone who has this desk anywhere. It's too bad because we don't even have one to show. Here's an example of what used to be. So if you ever find one, it might be worth some good money, I'm guessing. I haven't found it, so it's just interesting. All right, the next thing that what was happening here was the pork packing plant. Okay, and it started in 1880, and it went until 1909. It was on the west side of Shakopee, and on First Avenue, or First Street, I should say. The building eventually became the ice house, and you may have remembered pictures of that. But that's all we know about that also, except that it was there for a while. Of course, you know, we have pork, so we got a lot of pork around. They use that, you know, so it makes sense that it was a thing. But obviously, excuse me, wasn't that good because in 1909 they stopped. All right, the next one, the Schroeder Brick Company. This one, again, is something that you should probably know. And here's an example of one of the bricks. These things are worth a lot now because it has the Shakopee on it. There's not too many around anymore. so don't drop it.
Who says that to you?
I know.
Yeah, don't take it personally. We know that Herman Schroeder built it in 1876. And a lot of early buildings downtown are still there, were built by the red brick from the brickyard. Okay. Many of them are covered up with stucco downtown, but they are still there. So, and there's lists, where they are. You can see some when you go down downtown area. And there's a little picture. And just so you know, I'm not going to go really into too much about it, because basically they get the brick clay from the river, or by the river. It's really just leave it for a long time until it gets hard. That's kind of basically what they do. But there is a picture of this information, the same place I said before when I talked about the kiln that's on Market Street, where the Atlas Staffing is now. It just goes straight down 2 blocks until you get to the river, and right on the right there. And there's actually information of that information. You can also go and look at the house of Herman Schroeder also. You can't go in. It's somebody's house. I take pictures myself, but anyway. But I just want to say that building with brick was very popular. And it was popular because there's so many fires. So this is something that they knew to help to stop it. And so here, just look what it looked like. Here's down below are all those bricks, being thing, and they're working on it. And here's there is a map, and this again is on one of the signs too. Shows where everything is, and where the house is, and where the brick thing is. This is Bluff Avenue East. Okay. And Minnesota Street 191. And here's their house, the Herman Schroeder. So obviously they were doing well also, okay? And there's lots of interesting pictures, the people while they're working in bricks. And it's just interesting to know about the Shakopee brick was very different than the Chaska brick and the LeSueur brick. If you go downtown Shakopee, most of the stuff is by Shakopee brick. There's one bar that is all Chaska brick. You know which one I'm talking about?
Arnie's.
Arnie's, yeah. And you know why they have that? I guess it was a fight with the city. They were back and forth, so they have it there. It just makes it kind of interesting. So now if you go down the top, you'll notice those ones, really the white brick, and it says Chaska on it. That's why they have it. There's a whole fight they had, I guess. All right. The next one we have is the Nameless Iron Work Factory. I always find it so interesting because this was its name. It's like, hello, can't you think of a name? I do know that the person who owned it was Bierland's, I think its name, okay? And it started in 1888. And it was a foundry, basically, but it burnt down in 1925, and was never rebuilt. Okay. So I don't have too much more about that, except I just wanted to know that it was there, and it was popular for quite a while. Okay. And the Minnesota Stove Company, I added underneath American Range Corporation because basically the Minnesota Stove Company became the American Range Company. Same place, just over time. Here's a picture.
Is that on West 3rd?
Yes. No, West.
Near the bar.
Yes.
With
Yes.
the
Yes.
side, yeah.
And here's another picture of that. And I'm just kind of switching out through here, but here's pictures of people. Yes, some people do work here. Here's the big party for the American Range Factory, they have parties, annual picnics, okay? And again, this is a very, they made the stoves, and there's lots of pictures of that and information about that, but it's just kind of interesting to see. Do you know where this would be related to the buildings in the background, anybody? I don't either, but I thought you guys might know, I don't know. I mean, eventually, we'll be there, yeah. Yeah, and we'll talk about that here in a second. Okay, the next one, I'm just going to do a quick one, but basically is the Redmond Ice Cream Factory, and they started in 1921. And in the recording, Collier said he remembers this because they used to go there at school as their travel, you know, the school would go out and go and see it in action. And they remembered because at the very end, they always got an Eskimo pie. And this is the reason people love the place, all right? And basically, they purchased the Dello Creamery on North Home Street and remodeled it into the ice cream factory. And it had a capacity of about 90 gallons per hour and about 1,000 pounds of butter daily. This is another one where I was working, so this is just like last night, I think. I couldn't find, I was looking at my 3 different books that I could find and anything, and I never found out when they stopped. But I'm sure, I know it did, and we'll find out and add that, but just so you know. And then we'll go to the next one, RAR. Are you familiar with that place? This is very, well known because it started in 1936 here, but it was before then. It was in Wisconsin, and it still is. Okay, it actually started in Lake Michigan in 1847. Okay, and it's now in the 5th and 6th generation of the same family, and started in Shakopee in 1836. The reason so many people like the company, I worked there for a year. God help us out. But this is one of those things where during summertime, if you're in college and you were going on to college, you could work there for the summer, and it helped them so that they could people have vacations, and at the same time they paid us well. So this was in 1980, let's say, and I think they paid me $11 an hour. I had been at Valley Fair working there, and that was $1.80 an hour, and then it switched to $1.90 an hour before I moved there. So it clearly was the place to go. So it was hard to get in, but you got in only if you were going on to continue on to college. So, and they have as a company, they're really good. They support a lot of projects here in town too, so that's a good thing. So here's just a few pictures here. Oops, I think I forgot this. This is the American Range Factory thing. So don't drop it. That one I don't. But anyway, you can know in terms of RAR, it's very, it's been expanding and then expanding and expanding. It's like, I think their 4th expansion it's happening now, or that just finished, I think. And and it's most used, I think, in like the most best malt in the world, I believe, and used. And they actually have, there's actually 3 different groups that are under the RAR thing, and that's the brewing supplies, okay, equipment. And then the second one is ingredients for that. And they use that now, especially because so many people are doing, making their own little breweries around, okay? And then the Coda Energy is actually tied into Metawakan Sioux community, and they work together, and this is a way where it's more friendly energy instead of coal, and so they use that together. So those three things are all tied in together. So just kind of interested in terms of the importance of that. And it's interesting to talk to people who grew up, who used to work at Russ, because I think they have some interesting history also. Okay? And so this is information if you ever need to get in contact. And so those, according to Collier's, those were the 14 important industry in early Shakopee. It's interesting because there are others, but it was clear these are the ones that he felt was important that he talked on the radio. And just so you know, coming up, if you look on this thing that show the things that are coming up, and there are a couple that are at the Shakopee Library, and the rest are all here. And like I said, it goes through December, and we'll continue with different topics, and then eventually we'll start over. All right, so thank you. Have a good day now.
Thank you, Jay.
Oh, Tim, what's the date is today? February what?
20.
Okay, is anyone close in birthday? Is anyone in February? Anyone born in February?
I think he's saying
You got it. So here's some recollections of early Shakopee pioneers in 1925. If you look at